The Detroit Red Wings have added Alex DeBrincat and some other pieces. Is it enough for them to return to the playoffs? The Nashville Predators have a new general manager and a new coach and a lot of changes. Can they bounce back this season? And the Tampa Bay Lightning hope to return to a long playoff run after an early elimination last year. All that and more coming up on today's Locked On NHL podcast.
You're Locked On NHL, your daily podcast on the National Hockey League. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
And welcome, everybody, to the Monday edition of the Locked On NHL podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I want to thank everybody who makes Locked On NHL your first listen every day. Don't forget to subscribe on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts so you can get new episodes as soon as they drop. And you can find Locked On NHL now on SiriusXM on the SXM app. Just do a search for Locked On NHL. It is great to have Brian Fisher of Locked On Red Wings back on the show. And Brian, certainly an eventful offseason in Detroit. Some big additions. I guess we can start with Alex DeBrincat. What is he going to bring to the table, and how much better does he make this Detroit team right away?
Well, what he'll bring to the table is goal scoring, and that is one of the biggest things. The Red Wings obviously have a lot of holes that they needed to address this offseason if they want to, take that step forward to compete. But on Scotty and I's list over at Locked On Red Wings, number one was goal scoring. Outside of Dylan Larkin last year, who had a career year, 79 points in 80 games played, the team really didn't have a scoring threat. Bertuzzi spent most of the year injured. He didn't really start picking himself back up to his old self until he got traded to the Bruins. And so they just needed somebody who could go out there and put the puck in the back of the net. Now, coming off of a down year with Ottawa Senators and the fact that he kind of forced his way to Detroit going home, the Red Wings were lucky to get him for so cheap. And, we still think, it's a little unfair, we think, to say that his 40-goal seasons were because of Patrick Kane, because that's always the biggest criticism, is he scored 41 goals twice, but he was also playing on one of the best playmakers the NHL has ever seen. We do think it's a little unfair to say that's the sole reason he could get to 41, but you have to also address that Patrick Kane was that man. He was the best guy, best playmaker one of the best playmakers the NHL has ever seen. So we think anywhere between 30 to 35 goals would be a good bounce back year for DeBrincat. He's playing on a line. He will most likely play on a line with Dylan Larkin. Dylan Larkin's a great two-way forward of his own, right? He can score 30 goals all on his own. You put someone of DeBrincat's caliber with him, that goal scoring is going to uptick for, I think, both those players, because DeBrincat isn't afraid to get in the corners and dig that puck out, despite the fact that he's 5'7", something like that. He plays bigger than he is. So I think that they're going to really help each other thrive in the upcoming season. And I already forgot what the second part of your question was. You asked me about DeBrincat. My brain won't.
Well, let me ask you this. What other areas does this team need to strengthen to get back to the playoffs? I mean, what are the biggest areas of concern at this point?
Goaltending is the biggest area of concern right now. Ville Husso obviously had he started off the season phenomenally last year for the Detroit Red Wings, and through the first quarter of the season was one of the best goalies at goals saved above expected in the entire league. He was top 5 at one point. But then I think the fact that the Red Wings had no genuine backup, they cycled through Alex Nedeljkovic and Magnus Hellberg, who had just awful years last year. There's no nice way of putting it. They were just horrible. So though I think the workload for Ville Husso eventually got to him, because it was his first ever year having to be the starter, and the workload got to him. The Red Wings' poor defense got to him too. And eventually he got the injury bug too by the end of the season. So as the season went on, his performance kind of got worse and worse. And I think he finished with an 8.96 save percentage, if I'm recalling off the top of my head properly. And they addressed some of the other woes. They got James Reimer, who also had a career worst year last year, but historically, has had a pretty solid. I think people overlook James Reimer, but he's historically been pretty good. Last year was the first year he's ever had a sub 900 save percentage his entire career. The big concern with him is that he's 35 years old. So you wonder how much of that save percentage last year was him falling off due to age versus him playing behind the San Jose Sharks, who were one of the worst teams in the league last year. Because the year prior, that Sharks team wasn't much better, and he had a 911 save percentage that year. So, you do wonder if he can bounce back. I do think he will. I think he will return to form. I do think age is a factor, but I don't think he'll be as bad as he was. I think he'll be low 900s, and that's what you need at a backup. And then Alex Lyon down there in the AHL, if Red Wings get really desperate, now they have an option in Grand Rapids because, Jan Bednar and John Lethman and Sebastian Cossa, I don't think are going to be ready for the NHL anytime soon. Cossa is like the main guy we're looking at. I don't know if Lethman and Bednar are ever going to have it in him.
Yeah. You touched on the defense briefly. Do you think that the defense core will be better this year? And if so, why?
Well, it's tough to get much worse based on where they were at last year. Last year, the Red Wings had 5 defensemen. They had 3 seventh defensemen. They had 3 guys who were competing for that 6th spot on the defensive core, and none of them could solidify their spot full time. It was Robert Haig, Jordan Osterley, and Gustav Lindstrom, and those 3 guys were all underperformed so much that none of them could ever just be the 6th defenseman. This year, all 3 of those guys are gone. The Red Wings obviously brought in Gostisbehere, who I think is going to be a huge offensive kick, especially after they traded away Filip Hronek. They're going to need a guy like Gostisbehere to help bring that offense. 1-year deal. He'll be a great trade deadline bait if the Red Wings are in that position. Hopefully there'll be buyers this year. We're all hoping for that. And then Justin Holl, I think a lot of people, my thoughts on him are complicated because there is a little bit of the year prior, the Red Wings signed Ben Chiarot, and me and Scotty were like, that's not a good signing. And it's kind of proven to not be a good signing thus far. And people are saying the same thing about Justin Holl this year. I think Justin Holl is better than he's being given credit. I think he kind of became the scapegoat in the regular season for the Toronto Maple Leafs. And don't get me wrong, he had a horrible playoffs. There's no beating around the bush, but the advanced metrics say he's a pretty solid defensive defenseman in the regular season. He has been. And I think that is still an improvement over what the Red Wings had this last year. I don't think he'll get top 4 minutes. I think he might be a bottom pair defenseman for the Detroit Red Wings. And yeah, you're probably overpaying for that. You're probably paying him too much to play that role. But then that and the acquisition of Jeff Petrie, who I think still has enough left in the tank to play bottom 6 minutes, or not bottom 6, but bottom pair minutes on the right side. Red Wings defensive core, even if it is still a middle of the pack defensive core across the league, is improved when you compare it to the year prior.
Yeah, middle of the road is better than terrible. So
yes.
No question about that.
Up front, of course, Seider and Wallman, they found terrific chemistry last year in the NHL together. They were fantastic. At one point, had the best, I think it was expected goals against per 60 minutes in the entire league. Just great shutdown pair. And offensively, there's a lot to be liked there as well. So you have one true, really good pair, and then the rest after that's just kind of mediocre. But like you said, mediocre is better than bad, which it was last year.
Training camp is a few weeks away now. Any prospects that you have your eye on who have a chance to make this team?
Oh, that's a good one. So we just, in our Monday episode of Locked On Red Wings, we went over the prospect tournament, and the Red Wings have a lot of guys who are on the cusp of being full-time NHLers. Elmer Soderblom played 21 games with the Detroit Red Wings last year, nearly lost his rookie status. He's so big, 6'8" and has soft hands. He's a net front threat. He's a unicorn, but he has the same problems that everyone at that size does. He's a little unsure on his feet and can get knocked off the puck pretty easy. He's used to letting his pure size win him battles, but in the NHL, everyone's so strong, he can't get away with it. So if he improved on that, he'll be knocking on the door. Simon Edvinsson had offseason shoulder surgery. He's not going to be back probably until November at the latest, but he's going to have time in Grand Rapids. But obviously he was right on the cusp before that surgery. Albert Johansson, William Wallander on the defensive side of things as well. And when you're talking about underdogs, like your dark horse candidates for making the NHL roster, I keep your eye on guys like Carter Mazur out of the University of Denver, turned pro at the end of the season last year, tore up with Grand Rapids, like the end of their season. And same with Amadeus Lombardi. I think he's probably 1, maybe 2 years away in all reality, but Amadeus Lombardi just torched the OHL last year, just absolutely torched it. So I'm really excited for those guys. And then the cream of the crop, Marco Kasper, is going to be at the prospects tournament as well. And I think he's a real threat to bump Joe Veleno off the center role on the bottom 6. And I think long-term, they're looking at a top 6 role for him. You drafted him 6th, 8th overall, something like that. And he's going to be a really good center. And I think he's probably the closest to making the NHL roster out of anyone I just noted.
All right, Brian, why don't you tell our viewers and our listeners where they could find you on social media and where they could find the podcast?
Well, you can find the podcast on YouTube. Obviously, search Locked On Red Wings. You can find us on Spotify, Apple, Odyssey app. Shout out to the company I work for, Odyssey. We are on there as well. As well as you can find me on Twitter at Brian Fisher WWJ. And Scotty can be found on Twitter at Bentley Scotty. And the show's Twitter account is at LO_Red Wings.
All right, Brian, thank you so much for joining us. Always a pleasure.
No problem. Thanks so much for having me, Gil.
Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Get ready for the NFL season with incredible offers from FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Right now, new customers can bet $5 and get $200 in bonus bets guaranteed. Plus, all customers who bet $5 will get $100 off NFL Sunday Ticket from YouTube and YouTube TV. Now is the best time to join FanDuel, the app that is easy to use, and you can be on everything from point spreads to player props and more. And hey, with NFL Sunday Ticket, you could follow any of the 32 NFL teams regardless of where you live. So visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and kick off the NFL season with an offer you won't want to miss. FanDuel, official partner of the NFL. It is great to bring back to the show the co-host of Locked On Predators, Ann Kimmel. And Ann, it has certainly been an eventful offseason for the Predators, a new GM, a new coach, a new direction. How do you think the coaching change will affect the way the Predators approach the game this fall?
I think that's one of the biggest questions that fans are asking themselves. We haven't heard a ton from Andrew Brunette yet. You know, we heard from him at the press conference where he was introduced. And one of the things that is very clear is that the Nashville Predators are looking for him to take this team in a little bit different direction, looking to play a faster game, looking to score a little bit more off the rush, looking to be more offensive. So that's the overview of what we're looking at with Andrew Brunette. But he's also coming into a roster with tons of turnover. So how that's all going to play out is going to make for a really interesting training camp.
No question about it. And certainly for the returning players, I would assume there's going to be a learning curve and an adjustment period. How about some of the new players that, you know, this team has added? Ryan O'Reilly, Gustav Nyquist, where do they fit in, and how do they fit into the idea of being faster and scoring more off the rush?
Yeah, the Predators made a ton of moves. The minute free agency opened, Barry Trotz was on the phone. Of course, kind of the biggest to get for the Nashville Predators is Ryan O'Reilly. And one of the things that Trotz really highlighted with this signing of O'Reilly is not just on ice, which there is a lot of upside to Ryan O'Reilly on ice, but what he brings to a team that is also trying to develop some young players. So we're talking about somebody who has Stanley Cup experience, somebody who's won a Conn Smythe, somebody who has made deep playoff runs, somebody who is a veteran voice in the locker room. So a lot has been focused on what he brings off ice, but I don't want to overlook what he brings to the ice. Now, I know he's a veteran. In hockey years, he's considered very old, but I think Ryan O'Reilly really has what the Predators are looking for. He's a great two-way player, which I think benefits a team that has some younger players that are still working to develop that aspect of their game. There's a conversation about, will Ryan O'Reilly be the 1C for the Nashville Predators, or has Cody Glass done enough, or will he do enough in training camp where maybe he will get that opportunity for that big role? So either way, you're definitely going to see a lot of Ryan O'Reilly on the ice for the Nashville Predators.
How about the defense core? Do you think they will be better this year? And how will the change in style affect this team's ability to defend?
Yeah, the defense really has had an extreme makeover. It started at the trade deadline when the Predators lost Mattias Ekholm, who is one of the best defensemen in Nashville Predators history. Of course, we got Tyson Barrie in that deal, and he brings an element of offense that maybe Mattias Ekholm's game didn't have. So you're looking at maybe a little bit more offensive minded as far as the defensive core. You have Luke Schenn, who's a little bit of a heavy hitter, which I think brings that physicality, but you're you're also looking at a Predators team who relies a lot on Roman Josi. And Josi, missed some games with injury last season, but he really is such an important part of the Predators offense for a defenseman. So much goes through Roman Josi. And so I think you're going to see them try to focus more on getting him more involved in things and hoping that kind of the back end can solidify the defensive end for the Predators.
And how about the power play? I would assume, guys like O'Reilly, guys like Josi will play a big role there. Do you think that Andrew Brunette will have a slightly different approach to the power play than his predecessor did?
We can certainly hope so. Statistically speaking, last season was a down year for the Nashville Predators on the power play. And so this year, I think that's one of the things that fans are most looking forward to with Andrew Brunette coming in, because of course he worked with the power play with the New Jersey Devils. They've got a ton of firepower on their special teams. So what is he going to do with this team? I think you're right. So much is going to go through Roman Josi, Ryan O'Reilly. There are also a couple of young players that may do enough to see some time on the power play. Think about players like Luke Evangelista, maybe Phil Tomasino, Cody Glass did a lot net front on the power play at the end of the season. So I think it's going to be an interesting mix of veterans and youth on the power play. And what I like about it is with Andrew Brunette coming in, it's really who's going to earn it. Everybody's going to have to earn their minutes with this new head coach.
Let me ask you a little bit about the transition from David Poile to Barry Trotz, because this is actually the first change in general managers in the history of this franchise.
That's right.
How has that gone? How much input, if any, does Poile still have on this team? And what is the working relationship like between Poile and Trotz?
It has been such an interesting relationship to watch through this transition. This announcement was made, end of the season sort of, but Barry Trotz has been involved. This was kind of something that they brought him in. He was involved in conversations at the trade deadline and had input in that. When it comes to the trade, Barry Trotz was very involved in the decisions that the Nashville Predators made. David Poile really brought him in and opened the cupboard and said, let's walk through all of these big things together and see what's happening. And I think that's been an amazing experience for Barry Trotz. Of course, they have a long-standing working relationship as GM and head coach. So this is a little bit of a different dynamic, but it's been so beneficial, I think, for Trotz. There is no question now. Barry Trotz is the general manager of the Nashville Predators, and he is not afraid to make big moves. One of David Poile's dream moves was signing Matt Duchene. Barry Trotz bought out Matt Duchene. So he is definitely running the show. Of course, David Poile is still a part of the team in an advisory capacity. Word is, though, he does not have an office. So how much he is going to be involved kind of remains to be seen. I think he will always be an ear for Barry Trotz, which is a wonderful opportunity. David Poile, one of the winningest GMs in history. So this is a great benefit for the Predators. It's a great benefit for Barry Trotz as he tries his hand at general managing.
Should be interesting. And after watching Barry Trotz up close for a few years on Long Island, definitely pulling for him. Yeah. Any prospects, any young players who have a good shot at making this Predators team this year?
I think out of training camp, one of the young players that we saw at the end of last season has a very good shot, and that is Luke Evangelista. He played 24 games in the regular season, went back and played in the postseason for the AHL. Milwaukee Admirals had a fantastic postseason. So he's definitely a player to keep an eye on. Another one is Joakim Kemell. He hasn't played a ton of North American hockey yet, but he did play in the postseason in Milwaukee. He may be a call-up this season for the Nashville Predators. Of course, they had Juuso Parssinen. They had Phil Tomasino. So those are some players who I think are really going to be battling for a spot. There's definitely a number of prospects to keep an eye on, whether they make it up to Nashville or whether they're playing in Milwaukee.
And why don't you tell our viewers and our listeners where they could find the podcast and where they could find you on social media?
You can listen to Locked On Predators anywhere you get your podcast and on YouTube. We are on Twitter, X, however you want to call that app. We are at LO_Predators. And you can find me on that same app at AnnK_Mama on Ice.
All right. And thank you so much. Always a pleasure talking hockey with you.
Thanks, Gil.
It is my pleasure to welcome back to the show the host of Locked On Lightning, Adam Danker. And Adam, an interesting offseason for Tampa Bay. A lot of changes, especially among the depth players. Out of all the players that they lost, who is the biggest concern that it'll be difficult to replace?
Well, I think we could both agree probably the obvious choice here is Alex Killorn. There was talk for not just this season, but the last couple of seasons. If the Lightning were not going to get a deal done, which we kind of all assumed was going to be the case, who was going to slide into his shoes? The Lightning, as we all know, the last couple of years have had and have been able to enjoy players sliding into new roles like the Nick Pauls, Mikey Eyssimont last offseason, to name a more recent one. But I think we were all surprised, though, Gil, when Connor Sheary was signed, sliding into that second line role. And he's going to add something that we already got from Killorn, and that was that leader mentality. As we all know, Sheary, through his time in Pittsburgh, he's been to the Stanley Cup Finals. He's won it. He knows what it takes to get there. And he adds a little bit more of scoring, which, we're excited to have. Killorn was kind of a jack of all trades, but with Sheary, you kind of have a guy who is going to be able to find a way to score where and whenever he can, and also make the players around him better.
Well, that definitely helps, and it's a good addition. How about Pat Maroon? I mean, as someone who's been covering the Islanders, he was always a thorn in our side, especially in those playoff series. Who do you think that they've brought in who can replace Maroon in that sort of a sandpaper agitator kind of role?
Well, we already had Mikey Eyssimont from last year. Him along with Tanner Jeannot, who I think we could all agree, X amount of games in the second half of the season isn't exactly going to be, the tell-all for what Tanner Jeannot's tenure with the Lightning is going to be. But as we all know, at the end of the day, even though he's not going to score points, he's still going to go out there and he's going to be able to throw his body around and his weight around on the ice. And also with the offseason additions, the Lightning also bring in Calvin DeHaan. They also have the leader defenseman in Zach Bogosian, who is no stranger to Lightning fans, was with the Lightning when they won in 20, came back after a brief tenure in Toronto. So, it's not so much it was a concern when Maroon was traded away. I think it was more so that we had a plethora of guys that could be kind of the sandpaper guys. So, that's obviously not a bad problem to have.
The Lightning went to 3 straight Stanley Cup Finals, won 2 of them. This past year, the season ended a lot earlier. The team will be more rested as a result. Do you think going to the Stanley Cup Final 3 years in a row did tire this team out last year? And how much do you think the extra rest will make a difference?
Well, absolutely. I mean, you saw it from opening night against the Blackhawks last season, how tired this team was. And they did some things that, you could always kind of look the other way on physical mistakes, maybe not cutting off the angle on a puck down the board, or, not picking up a guy down low. But, the one thing that really stood out with this team, really from the get-go last season, was really the mental mistakes and really not being able to get into the flow of the game early on. The Lightning, I think, were one of the most notorious teams in the league at being slow starters. So, this team, to say that they were tired after going to the Stanley Cup Final, and let's remember, Gil, they went to the Stanley Cup Final twice in the span of 9 months and won both times. So the fact that they did it in 3 years, twice in 9 months, to say that this team was tired was definitely an understatement. I was actually one of the few that was really almost kind of, I wouldn't say, I mean, you never want to wish for your team to lose, but I kind of felt like if I had to pick one or the other, whether the Lightning making a deep run and not winning the Stanley Cup, or having an early exit, I say that to my listeners, it kind of caused a little bit of a rift there for a little bit. I was the more so in the camp of, if you're going to lose early, so you get as much rest as possible. You saw it from top to bottom. Especially Vasilevsky in the playoffs. And you kind of saw it in that Leafs series. He was just kind of pretty much overwhelmed. He was tired, but you saw obviously as the series went on, he gets better. I mean, that's just what we come to expect from him. He's one of the best in the world. But you're going to see a very rejuvenized Lightning team this season. And really, you're going to see a lot of, even though the faces might be a little bit different with this Lightning team, you're going to see a lot more of the same that what you saw from those championship teams a couple of years ago.
You mentioned Vasilevsky. Ideally, how many games would you want him to start this year? And who do you think fills in as the backup?
Well, the Lightning picked up, they made up they had a really good pickup this offseason. They got Jonas Johansson, a veteran in the league. And I say that, very timidly. He's 27. So I guess, old maybe by NHL standards, who knows, depending on who you're talking to. But ideally, I would say the magic number for Vasilevsky is probably 43. 45, I think, is kind of pushing it. Some Lightning fans would probably want a little bit more closer to 50. I think that, last year we saw Cooper really push the limit with Vasilevsky, and it wasn't like this team didn't need him to go out there. This team struggled really all season, and having Vasilevsky out there, even though he struggled just as much, was an added plus in especially in the big tight games for the Tampa Bay Lightning team. But you could see there were certain points during the season where he just had nothing left. And really that coupled with the Lightning's defensive issues at times, really, you could see it really got Vasilevsky down. But I think that Cooper is probably going to rein him in a little bit this season. You're not going to see him, really just jump out of the gates going. I think he's really going to throw Johansson out there, not only to give Vasilevsky rest, but to also give Johansson some looks, because there was times last season where, we had Elliott out there, and, as good as a backup Elliott was, going out there for 9 starts isn't really going to do much for you. And he was cold at times as well. So I think Cooper really seeing that as a learning experience for him. He's definitely going to I'm not saying that we're going to have a 2-goalie system in Tampa Bay, but it's as close as you're going to get to one.
Should be interesting, and hopefully that means Vasilevsky is rested and ready for the postseason. Adam, why don't you tell our viewers and our listeners where they could find the podcast and where they could find you on social media?
Well, as always, the podcast is available in audio form wherever podcasts are distributed. And you can follow us on our YouTube page as well, and follow us on Twitter. It's been a while since we talked, Gil. I don't know what we're calling it at this point, but you could, regardless of what you call it, you can find the podcast on Twitter, X at L_Lightning, and Lockdown_Lightning on Instagram, and follow me at Danky DNKYD8NK. We'll be previewing the season. We just got some extensions signed. The Lightning are spending money, so that's really, really positive thing to see. So we're talking about all that as we get ever closer to October.
Yeah, season just around the corner. I know you'll have it all covered on Locked On Lightning. Adam, always a pleasure. Thank you so much for joining us.
Always a pleasure to be on, Gil.
All right, I want to thank everyone who makes Locked On NHL your first listen every day. Everydayers tomorrow on the show, our hosts will look at the biggest stories from around the National Hockey League. There is no off season on Locked On NHL. We're here every Monday through Friday looking at hockey from all the angles. I want to thank my guests, Brian Fisher of Locked On Red Wings, Ann Kimmel of Locked On Predators, and Adam Danker of Locked On Lightning. I'm Gil Martin. I host the Monday edition of Locked On NHL. And of course, I am the co-host of the Friday edition along with Rachel Donner. Have a great day, everybody. Stay safe. And thanks again for watching and listening to the Locked On NHL podcast.